Morning, everyone, and welcome to our 9 a.m. briefing on the science and ethics of ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. We have Ken Buesseler here from Woods Hole and Margaret Leinen from Scripps. They're going to give you two great presentations, and then we'll open the floor to Q&A. As always, if you are online, you can put your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Please do identify yourself and tell us if you want us to read your question for you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ken. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome this morning to our session. I'm Ken Buesseler. I'm a senior scientist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Been looking for my career a lot at the ocean's role and the carbon cycle and climate. And my job this morning is to talk a little bit about the scale of the issue, what we're talking about when we think of what we could do for our climate and removing atmospheric CO2 into the ocean in particular, and how we might go about that. So that's what I'll be focusing on here today. The first slide should be familiar if you've been following the climate debate. The IPCC reports, it basically has those curves of the projected emissions if we do nothing. The blue line starts down a curve if we start reducing emissions, fossil fuel related energy emissions, and that's where we need to be going to keep our temperatures below 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees. What's kind of new on there is that blue wedge itself that relates to carbon removal. We basically reached a point where emissions reduction is not enough. We're going to have to consider other ways to remove what we've already introduced. Notice though, for scale, that blue is much smaller than the red. You know, we can't do this with just CDR, carbon dioxide removal. We will need immediate emissions reductions, but start thinking over the next decade or so about how we might go about removing what we've already put into the atmosphere, the greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide. I'll also point to the scale of this. It's about 35, 38 gigatons, billion tons of CO2 per year that we're putting in the atmosphere. And we're going to think about that in the next slide about what it would take to remove some fraction of that. And we're hoping to get to tens of gigatons in terms of CDR removal, but we're a long way from there. And I think I'll make that point pretty clear in the next slide. So this slide has two of the methods used on land for removing carbon dioxide. On the left, direct air capture, that's the plant in Iceland, Climeworks. It's the largest plant right now that's up and running. And through using geothermal power in that case, it's important for things like direct air capture that we're not using fossil fuels to accomplish what we want to do, removal from the atmosphere. But if you take that 35 billion tons that we're putting in each year, and if you ran that particular plant for an entire year, you'd remove 3 seconds worth of our emissions. 3 seconds, get that. So one direct air capture plant, the largest one we have. I know these are prototypes and we can build more, but there aren't that many places with the geothermal power or the rocks, but it's going to take an awful lot of DAC plants to make a dent in that annual emissions. So that's just a point about the scale of the problem we have. The one on the right, David Ho, a scientist in University of Hawaii, came up with this. He looked at 100 million trees. Another way we can do this on land is planting trees, right? Trees take up a certain amount of carbon dioxide every year. 100 million trees would be equivalent to 33 minutes of that emission, this current emissions as of today. So again, what that points to is we just are going to run out of land, right? We need land to feed people. There aren't many places to grow these at that scale. So we're going to have to find other solutions. And we think the oceans is one of those solutions we should be looking at. And this slide kind of shows the reasons why the oceans are so important in the carbon cycle. It's basically a big storage bin, call it a sponge, but the deep ocean has 37,000 gigatons, billion tons of carbon already dissolved in that seawater. So it's a big place to put it. If you look at the atmosphere there, it's about 600. So this is 50 times more carbon in the deep ocean than in the atmosphere. If you take all of the land plants and soils, you hear about soil management, growing trees, as we talked about. This is about 15 to 20 times more carbon stored in those deep ocean reservoirs. I'll get on the next slide to blue carbon in terms of coastal reservoirs. They're also much smaller than what I'm calling today deep blue carbon, the open ocean. So coastal blue is about 5,000 times smaller capacity. So this is storage. So that's kind of the reason for putting these things in perspective here. And so we've got to think about ways that we can change the arrows in and out of these reservoirs if we're going to alter our climate trajectory that we're on currently. So let's talk about those two ocean reservoirs and what they do for us for that 35 gigatons, a billion tons per year that we're emitting. If you look currently at the coastal blue carbon, so this is things like mangrove swamps, salt marshes, seagrasses, they would be able to compensate for 5 days of the emissions, much larger than we were talking about, the 100 million trees, so they are significant. And there's many, many reasons we should be protecting our coastal blue carbon resources, you know, from protection from storm damage, habitat, tourism. There's lots of reasons we want to keep these places around. But in terms of the big picture, it's really that deep blue ocean. This 3.4 months is the number you hear when people say the ocean takes up about 25 to 30% of our annual emissions. So it is a place that right now currently is taking up carbon dioxide, thankfully, or our climate crisis would be much worse off than it currently is. So these are the reservoirs we're talking about, considering really what we could do to enhance their storage, their uptake of atmospheric carbon dioxide. I was fortunate to be on this US National Academies committee, and we were assigned to look at 6 ways to do this. There are more, and we can talk maybe a bit about those in Q&A, but we kind of divided them into what's happening biologically on the left side and what you might engineer on the right side. The size of the circle is kind of a bit of our enthusiasm. This is a 300-page consensus report. I've got one more slide. The punchline is we think all of these deserve attention. The one slightly larger circle is adding nutrients. That's what I'll end on. That's something I work on. Seaweed farming. So there are different ways to grow plants in the ocean that would take up, like those trees, carbon dioxide. Nutrients affects the microalgae, the phytoplankton. Seaweed we're more familiar with. That's happening now, but that can be enhanced. The large circle on the right, alkalinity addition. You can change the chemical balance in the ocean, so more of the atmospheric carbon dioxide gets in through the air-sea solubility process, a solubility pump. Others on there, ecosystem recovery in the open ocean we were assigned to look at. It's a great thing to be doing, but it's probably doesn't have the capacity to really dial in and change climate in significant ways. And 2 others we looked at in that 333-page report, it's about 1 year ago this month that we released, using tubes, kind of bringing up water that's nutrient rich, that brings up carbon dioxide. So that's why it's slightly more difficult to figure out ways to use that technology, or putting electrical power directly into seawater and trying to change its chemistry or capture carbon dioxide. But that's very energy intensive, and we don't yet have the non-fossil fuel energy sources to do that on big scales. So the takeaway messages, as I wrap up here from that report from the academies, emissions reductions are key, but not enough. This is not the get out of jail free card for fossil fuel industry. Research needs to be studied now. My biggest regret is some of the work on the next slide I'll talk about we were doing 20 years ago and ended because of lack of support, basically, funding to do this. We're not endorsing the scientific community any particular one of these, but we think the research is needed so you could decide and make a reasonable decision. It's not just about the technical feasibility, it's about governance of the ocean's common, right, and acceptance of these. Funding for this type of study needs to involve federal research agencies, as we have traditionally, but also philanthropies, potentially corporate sponsors. And again, the field studies themselves, so that's what we're urging in many cases, particularly on the next slide, I'll talk about ocean iron addition, will not cause irreparable harm. They're so far away from the billion-ton scale that we really are not going to permanently be altering the ocean by conducting this type of research. And so I think we don't want to mix those up. And as Margaret will get on to, we need some sort of ethical standards, ways to say how we do this and how this gets regulated. So my last slide, we've got few copies out there of a white paper that a group I'm involved in, Margaret also, called Exploring Ocean Iron Solutions. We have a website, Ocean Iron. The exploring is a pretty key word. We don't have a solution. That's maybe too strong of a word, but we hope to do the types of studies you need to look at durability, the scaling of adding this nutrient. So plants, if you haven't heard of this before, the phytoplankton, the marine plants out there that produce half of the oxygen we breathe, right? Very important part of the carbon cycle, often are limited in their growth by the nutrient iron. So sort of like phosphorus or nitrogen, you need iron to grow. So if we add small amounts of iron, we can get a big response. We know that from experiments, but can we scale that up? What would the full range of ecological impacts be? What's the cost per ton, right? And how would you do that in an ethical way, the best practices? So where that group is at is basically setting up an R&D program and then looking for collaboration and sponsors. And I'm certainly happy to talk about that more in the Q&A part. Thank you. I think there's a QR code there, if you can read it from the back, or again, we have handouts with that on it.
Hi, everyone. I'm Margaret Leinen. I'm the director of Scripps Institution of Oceanography. And I want to talk a little bit about how we think about these experiments and how we think about all the all the concerns that have been raised about the ethics of trying to sort of turn the knobs on a natural ecosystem like the ocean. So how do we proceed in a way that assures all that the research into carbon dioxide removal and projects like the one that Ken has talked about will be conducted in a responsible and principled way, and that all of the information from them is open and available. The climate intervention community has been trying to deal with this for over 15 years. And first, a couple words about terms. So 15, 20 years ago, anything that looked at trying to either remove carbon from the atmosphere or shield the planet to solar radiation was called geoengineering. Now, there's a whole area of engineering that's called geoengineering that has absolutely nothing to do with climate. It's large earthen structures and so forth. It's a branch of engineering. And of course, they're very sensitive about being confused with trying to modify the climate. So the community started looking for other terms that were more specific. One of those is climate engineering, as opposed to geoengineering. And then the community has looked at intervention techniques, things like managing solar radiation and remediation techniques like carbon dioxide removal. So I just want to point out that in this community that we work in, there are different people using different terms for all of these processes. I'm going to refer to it as climate engineering. So during the early 2000s, the House of Commons in UK was very interested in this issue. They had been convinced by scientists in UK that research into this was necessary. And there was a lot of enthusiasm around the topic. And the UK House of Commons decided that it should look at regulating this process. And they were focused primarily on regulating any deployment of they used the term geoengineering, not necessarily research. And as part of their work, they talked with scientists and academicians at Oxford who were exploring the ideas around geoengineering and asked them about principles for governance of geoengineering. So a group of 5 academics put together a set of principles for the deployment, for the governance of geoengineering. And I've abstracted these. You can find them online into a shorter phrase so that you can understand what it is on the slide. The first was that geoengineering should be regulated as a public good. And that's code for geoengineering should not be conducted as a profit-making activity. Second, that public participation in geoengineering decision-making was necessary. That disclosure of geoengineering research and open publication of results was necessary for the governance. That independent assessment of impacts should take place. That would be impacts beyond the removal of carbon dioxide. And that governance should be established before deployment. So these have been called the Oxford Principles. And they weren't specifically focused on research, and they also had not been generated by a large community. And so there was a lot of talk at that time about why why such a small group would establish the principles. In 2010, the Climate Response Fund, which was a small nonprofit that I was leading at the time, developed an approach for an international conference at the Acidification Conference Center in California on principles for research into climate engineering. So not talking about deployment, but just research. And the location was chosen specifically, and the approach to the conference was chosen specifically to echo the 1975 Acidification Conference on recombinant DNA. Recall that at that time, recombinant DNA was viewed with alarm and skepticism. And Paul Berg and a couple of other very prominent scientists organized a conference at Acidification from the people involved. They also brought in nonprofits, government entities, and so forth to talk about this. And they developed they self-identified principles for recombinant DNA research. So our effort was to try to do that for climate engineering. There were more than 170 people there. In addition to scientists, there were historians of science, ethicists, economists, government agencies, nonprofits, and the press was invited as well. And that group put together a series of principles for climate engineering research. And you'll see that they're very similar to the effort in the Oxford Principles, that this research should promote the collective benefit. It should establish responsibility and liability in advance of doing experiments, that the research should be open and cooperative, as opposed to being done, for example, by a private sector company where the data and the results were not published. That iterative evaluation and assessment should take place in order to identify impacts beyond simply reducing carbon, and that there should be public involvement and consent for any experiments. And this last piece really came from work that was being proposed at the time, but proposed without public consultation. And several large experiments at the time were essentially shut down because of lack of public agreement. So these were principles that were established for research. We've had several iterations since then. The Carnegie Climate Governance Group has proposed a code of conduct for responsible geoengineering research. It was delivered and was really focused primarily on solar radiation management. That is, techniques that would prevent solar radiation from warming up the lower atmosphere. And then in addition to the work that that Ken talked about with ocean carbon dioxide removal, the National Academy also looked at reflecting sunlight, and they have recommendations for solar geoengineering research and research governance. So there's been a lot of activity in this area trying to come to agreement on those principles. When Ken and the science group that he has been working with started talking about this, we said that we really needed to come to agreement on principles for that research, ethical principles, code of conduct. And after looking back at all of the literature that's been developed in the last 15 years or so, we chose to establish principles that were based on the Acidification conference, primarily because it included such a large diversity of points of view. And it focused on carbon dioxide removal explicitly, in addition to solar radiation management. So the principles for this experimentation with ocean iron fertilization are again very similar. Since then, a very interesting development has emerged, and that is an effort that AGU is helping to organize and helping to lead. And that effort is looking at principles for geoengineering research. And the difference is, I think, that first of all, it has many more voices than were at the Acidification conference. It has the scope of the entire scientific community that AGU represents. It also has made an active effort to include the Global South in talking about this, representatives of the climate justice community, and representatives of indigenous peoples. All three of those had not been involved in previous efforts to look at principles. And a white paper that's the first product of that effort is online and has been discussed in a couple of sessions here at the AGU meeting. And AGU has interacted with the subsidiary body on science and technical advice of the UNFCCC at COP27 in Egypt to let them know about this effort and to talk with them about having the SUBSTA, the scientific body on science, or the subsidiary body on science and technology advice, considered this explicitly at their summer meeting. So AGU hopes to provide the final principles to them at that time. And one of the things that makes me very optimistic about this effort is that it's the first time that a very large effort to establish principles has been developed and that is actually interacting with the UNFCCC structure. So I think that if the UNFCCC starts taking a look at these, and of course that's an international body within the UN Framework Convention, we can have this discussed by governments and come to some agreement about those principles for research. And they've been so important in causing reluctance to engage in research that I think that getting them into the framework process is a way forward so that we can come to agreement, we can allow the research community to start doing this work with the blessing of the countries involved in UNFCCC. So this is, I think, for the ability to start to do research on this, I think a real game changer. And we all really appreciate AGU's leadership in convening and joining with other groups around this. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Leinen. Dr. Buesseler, we'll open the floor to questions here in the room in Chicago and online. If you are here in the room, wave at me. I'll bring you a microphone. Please identify yourself. If you're online, please drop a note into the Q&A. Please do tell us who you are so that we can get to you. Any questions for reporters in the room? In the back, WBUR.
Hi, I'm Barber Moran from WBUR in Boston. Thank you for this presentation. I'm wondering, I have a question about if the ocean absorbs more CO2, won't it become more acidic? And how do you deal with that?
Yeah, if I can, Ken Buesseler here again. Ocean acidification is one thing we would actually, on the surface, reduce, because we will effectively reducing that atmospheric carbon dioxide, which sets the level of carbon that's dissolved in the ocean seawater. So the intent is, and when you look at, say, the iron enrichment experiments, we create blooms of carbon, reduce locally the acidification effect, and drive that deeper in the ocean. That process is happening already, so we will be creating a more acidic deep ocean, but that's that big reservoir, right, that it's harder to perturb. So we will be actively trying to speed up the natural process, at least with these ones that create fertilizer, or if you're growing seaweed, that type of thing. So what we're trying to do, and the same with the alkalinity techniques, is kind of reduce the acidification at the surface directly through removing the CO2 that's in the atmosphere. So they would have a net benefit in that regard. That makes sense?
More questions in the room? All right.
Hi, I'm Gregory Barber from Wired magazine. Thank you so much for the presentation. And thank you in particular, Margaret, for going through the history of the different ethical frameworks. One thing that came up for me seeing the frameworks side by side like that was, in particular, this move from regulated as a public good to promoting or prioritizing collective benefit. I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, like what kind of motivated that move away from that language around public good and the kind of the sort of government kind of mandate around regulating this type of research.
Right. I think that both, well, all of the principles were trying to get at the same idea, which was that research should not be conducted with the expectation that you're going to sell carbon credits as a result of it. And each of the frameworks chose a different set of words to say that, but all of them, if you look at the longer version of all of those in the published pieces, it's all trying to get at the idea that you don't fund the research by selling carbon credits. And back in sort of 2005 or so, there was a lot of thinking that that was the way to get this research done. The focus would really be on that the research was a public good.
I'm just curious, basically I just wanted to ask what you see as the role of that kind of funding now in this research, whether the carbon credits do have a role to play in funding research of this sort.
I personally don't think that well, there's a difference between private sector funding for research and private sector making a profit from the research to pay for it. And I think that there's, the community has accepted the fact that the private sector is interested in this. There's a lot of venture capital sloshing around in this field right now. But all of the responsible players, all of the folks that we know, not only for ocean iron fertilization, but alkalinization and hydrolysis and whatnot have said that they're not trying to sell carbon credits from experiments. So there's a distinction there in terms of the participation of the for-profit community. Obviously, all of venture capital is hoping that the research will show that it's a great whatever they've invested in is a great technique, and that you will be able to sell carbon credits eventually, or that that governments will want it done because they want CO2 out of the atmosphere, and therefore the companies will do it, whether that's getting funding directly from the government to do it, or whether it's selling carbon credits.
I could add something too. I think, the commercialization in a way will move ahead without good science, right? If there's money to be made on claiming a carbon credit, that would be a business model that maybe someone can profit on. And I think what worries some of us, there's a lot of attention on how you would account for that carbon. But we're also interested in looking at the ecological impacts, what's the larger picture, and who's going to be responsible for that kind of monitoring, reporting, verification. MRV is the buzzword of the ecological side. And so that's built into the research much more directly than some of the commercial models. And so I think we have to be leery sometimes about moving ahead and just counting carbon if we're really affecting larger systems on our planet, particularly, well, in the ocean and on land.
More questions from the room? In the back.
Hi. I was wondering, I know that there's a number of proposed techniques out there for CDR, and I'm wondering if you're concerned or giving thought to all these various methods being used and interacting with each other in some way that has sort of unintended or surprising effects.
Yes, concern. I think just a lack of knowledge. Certainly, as we're moving in different places, carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, there'll be different knock-on effects, right? If we start taking CO2 in the ocean, there'll be sources coming out of land to replace that. There's a lot of global systems science and modeling that tell us that, but it's very hard to predict, I think. I'm not a modeler, as you probably can tell by that answer, because I don't think they have all of the answers, but accountability will be important. Also, if you just take any one approach like iron, how would you know that the iron that one company adds has this effect versus someone next to it? We'll have to find ways to kind of separate those out, different accounting systems. We're not there yet. So I don't think we have the complete answers of how they'll interact, but everything we do in the ocean on land will kind of affect this balance. And so that air-sea exchange will get smaller when we thankfully have less CO2 in the atmosphere. That's good, right? That's where we want to get to. But how those exactly will interact and some of the downstream effects we care a lot about in the ocean. The ocean moves, so it's not just like growing a patch of trees. We've got to think about taking up nutrients and growing more seaweed or algae in certain areas, how that uptake of nutrients affects what's living downstream that also requires nutrients, how those systems change. And that's what we're hoping to get to with the further research that can inform the models that will allow us to extrapolate that in kind of a more real world way.
Any further questions in the room? Yeah.
Thanks for the presentations. I'm Raymond Zhong with the New York Times. I didn't realize the Acidification conference on recombinant DNA was the model for the 2010 one on this subject, which is interesting. Could you summarize, where are we with the research? I mean, if recombinant DNA was the model in 1975, and then we've seen where that research has come since then, are we following a similar trajectory with ocean CDR? Does it feel like we still are very much at the cusp of all this research? I just wonder if there's a way you might summarize and help us understand.
Well, I think that since 2010, there has only been one experiment of any size in the ocean that was conducted. It was conducted with the knowledge and agreement on that the experiment would be safe from the London Convention. So the London Convention regulates dumping in the ocean, and it had spent 2 years looking at ocean CDR techniques and agreed to review experiments. So we at least have one model for who would actually look at the experiments to assure nations and communities that simply doing the research was not going to be a problem. So this has been 23 or 13 years with no experimentation at all. That stands in fairly stark contrast to what happened with recombinant DNA. After the agreements about what was and wasn't on the table for recombinant DNA, NIH started funding work on recombinant DNA regularly, as did others in other countries. So we've seen really a flowering of that. It's resulted in a lot of work, both for disease and for agriculture. We just have a rich landscape of recombinant DNA research. The same is not true for climate intervention or climate engineering. There have been laboratory experiments, but nothing that actually, other than that one experiment, not much has gone on in the ocean, and certainly not any experiments that would actually allow you to look at some of the things that Ken has talked about: ecosystem impacts, downstream impacts of the research, et cetera.
Do you think, why haven't we quite followed that same trajectory yet? 13 years after 1975, why aren't we there yet with CDR?
Funding agency fear of having experiments shut down. We've had 3 examples of experiments that were funded by governmental research funding agencies. All of them have been related to solar radiation management, not CDR, that have been shut down by community concern. And so, I understand. I spent time at National Science Foundation, and funding somebody for an experiment and then having a very public shutdown of that is something that really chills the climate for funding.
And just to add, and you'll know this from the Times, I mean, the public just has kind of come around. They're experiencing the impact of climate change, the wildfires, the heat stress and deaths, the sea level rise, the storm frequency, and so on a more daily basis. It's impacting their lives. They want to do something. They might understand the graph of, well, we got to get there in a couple of ways, or they might be confused that we're just going to make up an excuse for emitting fossil fuels and reducing what's already there. We don't think we have the tools to do that. There's often people looking for the next shiny object too. What's the one thing that's going to solve us? I think I would walk away from those stories pretty quickly. There's really not one silver bullet. We call it silver buckshot, right? There are going to be multiple ways where you take a little bit of that carbon dioxide out, but at the same time, the biggest part of this has to be emissions reduction. So it's important to work on carbon dioxide removal. I feel compelled to do it as a scientist, as one of the great questions for humanity right now, but it's not the solution. It's not one thing that's going to solve it. And the public, I think, has realized that the philanthropies are coming around too. So the sign of this change is groups are funding this that 15, 20 years ago, we're staying away from geoengineering altogether.
Any last call for questions in the room? And online?
There was a
Nope.
woman
Oh,
at the back who
question.
had her hand up.
Did I miss a hand? Okay. Well, I think,
Okay.
with that then, we'll close this Q&A. Thank you so much to our panelists. Our next session will be at just 15 minutes in the roundtable room across the hall for those of us here, or click that Zoom link from the events page. It's about which future climate scenario deserves center stage. I hope you join us there. The recording of this session will be available on AGU's YouTube channel in about an hour. We'll also upload their slides to the press information exchange for registered reporters, and we'll make that white paper on the framework for climate intervention available to you as well. Thank you all for coming.